Hey, welcome to Night Whispers. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? And if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe, it really helps. Now, let's get into the stories. I knew the evening hunt was going to be tricky the second I saw how fast the daylight faded. I'd spent the entire day perched up in my stand, thinking this was just like any other trip into the woods. The autumn chill had settled in, and the leaves underfoot had gone from a vibrant gold to something darker, almost foreboding. Still, I'd been out here enough times to know how things usually played out. When I finally took the shot, my mind was on autopilot. I squeezed the trigger, heard the crack, and watched the deer drop. There was this immediate rush, a split-second jolt of relief, because I'd been waiting all day for that moment. Once I climbed down, though, the reality started gnawing at me. It was dusk, and I had a hefty 5-pointer on my hands. 5 miles back to the truck felt a lot farther in the creeping dark than it had in the early morning light. I'd left my gear cart about 2 miles away from the actual shot site, so hauling the deer that short distance initially didn't faze me. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the woods seemed quieter than usual. Too quiet, like something was off balance. But I chalked it up to the usual post-harvest hush. Animals sense commotion and scatter, right? When I reached the cart, everything switched from mildly inconvenient to downright horrible in an instant. I tried strapping the deer in, but the second I started wheeling forward, the cart jolted and leaned. The left wheel cracked so sharply it sounded like a gunshot echoing in the trees. Next thing I knew, the wheel hung by a sliver of metal before snapping completely free. I stared at that busted wheel, half laughing at my own stupidity for not checking the cart beforehand. That tiny laugh died quick when it sank in that I had no backup plan. No partner, no phone signal, just me and a deer that wasn't about to walk out on its own. My only real option? Sling the carcass over my shoulders and start moving. I hadn't gone more than a few hundred yards when I heard them, coyotes howling in the distance. It was faint at first. I tried to tell myself they'd stay near the gut pile I'd left behind. Maybe that was enough to keep them occupied. But every time I stopped to catch my breath, it sounded like more joined in. The noise echoed in the hollow spaces between the trees, getting louder, and suddenly I was worried I'd become a midnight snack if I didn't keep moving. You'd think I'd have nerves of steel after all the seasons I've spent out here, but something about that chorus of cries set my teeth on edge. I shoved my feet forward, ignoring the burn in my thighs and the ache in my shoulders from the deer's weight. My only goal was to push past the dry, semi-open area and get to higher ground. I knew a swamp waited ahead, an absolute nightmare in daylight, let alone in near dark. The tracks of mud and moss underfoot made each step a gamble. More than once, I slipped on the slick earth, imagining rows of yellow eyes behind every crooked tree trunk. The howls were growing bolder, and the sense of being surrounded started gnawing at me. When I finally paused to adjust my grip, the deer threatened to slide off my shoulders. My breath was ragged, and I could feel the hush of the forest pressing down. I tried listening for the coyotes, but the silence made it worse, like they were toying with me, waiting, getting closer. As I forced myself onward, all I could think was how things went from a regular day of hunting to a near nightmare in a heartbeat, and I still had miles to go. I had no idea how much more I had left in the tank, but I knew I couldn't let my legs quit. The swamp behind me felt like it wanted to swallow me whole, and every time a branch snapped, I imagined a pack of snarling teeth right at my ankles. My arms had gone numb beneath the weight of the deer, and my lungs were on fire. But I kept telling myself, just a little farther, just one more step. As I broke free of the thickest part of the bog, my boots finally met solid ground. Relief lasted maybe half a second, because the howls and yips were way too close. It sounded like at least a dozen creatures weaving through the trees, working together like a freakish team. I could sense them flanking me from both sides, creeping in, every bit of brush and undergrowth shifting with new movement. I forced myself into a half-run, the deer bouncing on my back, mud and water dripping down my legs. My grip was slick on the hatchet, but it was the only real weapon I had. The more I listened, the more I realized there were no single set of footsteps. It was a whole swarm, a living net that threatened to close around me. I remember the first glimpse of the fence up ahead, a tall silhouette against the moonlit sky. I focused everything on reaching that fence, ignoring the ache in my muscles. The closer I got, the louder the pack seemed to become, as though they knew my escape route and wanted to cut me off. My breath rattled in my chest, but I hurled myself up and over, deer and all, not even hesitating when my jacket caught on a length of twisted metal. The landing on the other side knocked every ounce of air out of me. My knees slammed onto gravel, and I sprawled forward with the deer rolling off me. My hands fumbled for the knife, or the hatchet, anything, expecting to see shapes leaping over the fence a heartbeat later. Instead, I heard them slam against it, snarling and raking their claws across the chain links. For a few gut-wrenching seconds, I figured they'd get through somehow. I braced for fur and teeth, digging my boots into the ground as if I could launch myself away at any second. Then it went quiet. The pack whined and paced, but eventually they faded back into the dark. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble picking up the deer. By the time I reached my truck, I nearly collapsed again, half from relief, half from the lingering terror gnawing at my nerves. I wanted to leave right then, but my body refused to cooperate. I locked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and let exhaustion take over. Maybe I dozed for a few minutes, maybe it was longer, but when a fist tapped against my window I gasped hard. A flashlight beam cut across the cab, and outside stood a DNR officer with a look in his eyes that said he'd never come across anyone, or anything, like me before. I cracked the window, still clutching my knife in one hand, and managed to blurt out the story: the broken cart, the chase, the fence. The officer kept glancing at the blood on my clothes and the deer in the back, like he was trying to figure if I was some kind of lunatic. Once he checked my tags, though, his whole posture eased, and he actually let out a shaky laugh. Called me wild man, then told me to get some rest. That moment felt surreal, like the night had been a fever dream, and this stranger's relief was the only real thing grounding me. After he left, I just sat there, breathing as evenly as I could manage. Part of me wanted to drive off and never look back. Another part of me was already thinking about next season, because apparently, I don't learn. I dozed off until the first pink streaks of morning crept in. Even though I got out of that swamp in one piece, something about the forest felt different from then on, like it had shown me a side of itself I'd never forget. I was alone at home that day, slouched on my worn couch, flipping through channels I didn't care about. The sky outside was gray, heavy with the threat of rain, so I figured the day would be as uneventful as it gets. But at some point, I noticed a few deer drifting into the yard. That sight usually brought a calm vibe, something I'd admire for a moment before going back to whatever I was doing. This time though, something about them felt off. The air outside felt strangely still, like every sound had been sucked away. The deer seemed normal at first, but I kept my eyes on them a little longer than usual, and that's when I realized one of their back legs was wrong. Every time it stepped, that leg bent in a direction I can't even begin to explain. I leaned closer to the window, my mind fighting to make sense of what I was seeing. The more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't just the one leg. Several of the deer, 3, maybe 4, had some unnatural curve to their joints. I tried telling myself it had to be a trick of the light, a weird angle, anything that would explain it. But the way their limbs moved just wasn't natural. It felt like they were almost learning how to walk for the first time, except they were doing it wrong. They kept standing there, nibbling at the grass, occasionally glancing in my direction, as though they sensed me watching from behind the glass. I didn't want to move, worried I'd scare them off, or, worse, attract their full attention. My breath caught in my throat every time one of them jerked its head up, ears twitching. The yard was silent, no chirping birds or rustling leaves, and that silence made each awkward step echo in my mind. My pulse hammered in my ears with every movement they made. Eventually, one of the deer started to stroll toward the tree line at the edge of the yard. The others followed. That was when I noticed something even more unsettling. As they walked away, their bodies looked like they were growing. At first I was sure I was imagining it, but I couldn't ignore how their torsos seemed to stretch, how their necks elongated to proportions that weren't possible. I found myself frozen in place, trying to piece together a scene that shouldn't exist. Every rational part of me screamed that animals don't just do that. The one with the most twisted leg was lagging behind the group, its back hunched at an odd angle, ribs pushing against its hide in a way that made me want to look away. But I couldn't. It was almost as though it sensed how disturbed I was, because it paused for a moment, turned its head toward me, and let out a sound. It wasn't a typical deer noise. It sounded warped, like a groan that buzzed through the air and left my stomach in knots. My grip on the windowsill tightened until my knuckles ached. The rest of the deer didn't seem fazed by the monstrous shift happening among them. They continued to walk deeper into the trees, each limb bending at uncomfortable angles. And I swear their silhouettes elongated too, like something out of a nightmare, slender forms fusing with the dim light. By the time they were half hidden by the trunks, I could barely recognize them as deer anymore. They were like outlines of something else, something not meant to be seen in daylight. I stood there in a haze, staring long after they disappeared. For the rest of the day, I replayed the scene in my mind, convinced I'd gotten it all wrong. Maybe it was a trick of the sun. Maybe I was just tired. Yet every time logic tried to reassure me, I'd remember the way that leg bent, or how their necks stretched to an impossible length, and my stomach churned all over again. That night, sleep was out of the question. Every noise outside made me jolt. Even the slightest rustling of leaves had me picturing those distorted shapes lurking just beyond the yard. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see one of them press its elongated head against the glass. My brain wouldn't let me forget. The memory was too fresh, too vivid. I started wondering if I should warn someone, call a game warden or a neighbor. But what would I say? The deer in my yard looked like something out of a horror movie? Nobody would believe me. I wasn't sure I believed myself. But the terror was real. My hands were trembling every time I walked past that window. I couldn't bring myself to open the door, worried that if I stepped outside, I might come face to face with those twisted creatures, or whatever they were. Hours dragged by. I flicked on every light in the house, convinced that staying in the dark was a bad idea. My mind conjured images of those deer creeping closer while I slept, their limbs contorting further, their eyes glinting with some unnatural awareness. I kept imagining them trying to get in, pushing against the walls with those warped legs, slowly changing shape as they tried to squeeze through any possible opening. By sunrise, I was mentally and physically exhausted. I mustered the courage to peek outside, but the yard was empty. Morning light flooded in, and for a second I questioned whether I'd let my imagination run wild. Still, a lingering dread hung in the air, an unshakable sense that something was fundamentally wrong with what I'd witnessed. This wasn't just a case of a lame deer or a small injury. It was an impossible transformation, a glimpse into something beyond normal comprehension. Even now, whenever I look outside, I have to brace myself. Part of me is sure I'll see those shapes again, drifting among the trees, limbs bending and stretching into unspeakable forms. And a part of me wonders if, one day, they'll come back. Maybe this time, closer than before. The thought of it leaves me restless, scanning the yard with wary eyes, waiting for the slightest hint of movement that might confirm my worst fears. I always thought I knew every inch of my grandparents' land in Azle, Texas, like it was my own private playground. That afternoon, the late sun hung in the sky, turning the horizon the color of a half-hearted fire. I wanted a moment to myself, so I wandered into the nearby woods, the same patch of trees I'd explored dozens of times. There was a rusty wire fence and a makeshift path covered in crumpled leaves, all of it as familiar as the back of my hand. The house wasn't far away, so I assumed nothing could really go wrong. I just needed a little time to breathe. The air felt strangely dense, almost pressing against my skin, and every step I took sounded louder than it should have. Usually the forest was calming, a chorus of crickets and the occasional bird call. But the silence that day was unnerving. I called out for my mom just to break the quiet, even though I had no real reason to. No response. A hint of worry began to grow, like the atmosphere had changed without me realizing it. Suddenly I heard my name, but it came out sounding off, like my mother's voice but somehow twisted. It made me hesitate. My gut reaction was to answer, so I called back, asking if she needed help. Again, no reply. I glanced around, trying to figure out the source of that voice. My heart pounded so fiercely that it was hard to think. In my head, I was running over all the reasons why my mom might be in the woods, but none of them made any sense. And that voice, it was familiar, yet nothing about it felt okay. A moment later, I saw movement behind a thick tree trunk. At first I assumed it was a deer, or maybe a stray dog, but then something long and gray came into view. A figure standing taller than any person I knew, with skin that looked worn and almost torn in places. Its teeth were sharp enough to catch the light in a way that made my stomach lurch. I stayed frozen, my breath hitching in my throat. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, yet I couldn't move. It shifted, almost like it was testing how I'd react, and that was all the signal I needed. My legs finally listened. I spun around and sprinted as fast as I could back toward the house, snapping branches underfoot and crashing through brush. The woods felt darker, like the sunlight was blocked out on purpose. My lungs burned and my eyes started watering, but I didn't dare slow down to look behind me. When I reached the clearing, the porch light was just flickering on, casting a shaky glow over the yard. I stumbled onto the grass, gasping. Mom and my stepdad were inside, talking casually about dinner, oblivious to the chaos I'd just escaped. My entire body was trembling. I tried to steady myself as I went in, not wanting them to see how rattled I was. Telling them felt impossible, like they'd chalk it up to a spooky daydream, or a kid's imagination. But I knew what I saw. I practically barricaded myself in my room, pressing my back against the door and closing my eyes, replaying every second. That evening, I didn't dare peek out the window, convinced something hideous might be staring right back at me, and all I could do was grapple with the thought that the stories my family once whispered in low tones might be more than just stories. The property I'd always viewed as safe wasn't so comforting anymore, and I realized I'd never look at those woods the same way again. That night felt impossibly long. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that ragged figure crouching in a corner of my room, waiting. My bed used to feel like a safe haven, but now it felt too exposed. Every sound outside, rustling leaves, a loose piece of gutter rattling, transformed into a potential threat. Sleep barely came, and when it did, dreams overwhelmed me. I'd see that thing's warped features and twisted grin wherever I turned. I'd jolt awake drenched in sweat, my mind struggling to separate nightmares from reality. By morning, I was a wreck. My mom asked if I was feeling sick, but I just shook my head and mumbled something about not sleeping well. She didn't press, but I noticed her concerned glance linger a little longer than usual. Part of me wanted to tell her everything, but words seemed too small for something so large and terrifying. I worried she'd brush it off, or, worse yet, believe me, and still not know how to help. The days that followed only added to the unease. I couldn't set foot outside without expecting to see that shape skulking behind a tree, waiting for me. Sometimes, I'd walk the perimeter of the house, trying to convince myself I was just paranoid. I started hearing faint echoes of footsteps that never matched mine. Late at night, the yard took on an unnatural stillness, like everything else had backed away from our property. Even my grandparents' dog, an old mutt who usually barked at the slightest movement, stayed curiously quiet. I turned to my grandfather, hoping for some hint that maybe he'd run across a weird animal or suspicious trespasser before. He was usually the first to dismiss ghost stories, but this time, he paused. I saw a flicker in his expression, like he was recalling something he'd tried to bury. He wouldn't explain it outright, only muttered that some legends are best left alone, then advised me not to wander too far into the woods. It was a short conversation, but it left a long shadow over my thoughts. His reaction, that single spark of unease in his eyes, was enough to confirm I might have crossed paths with something truly out of the ordinary. The tension built day by day. I'd try to distract myself by doing chores around the yard or watching TV with my stepdad, but my mind refused to settle. The house's walls felt claustrophobic, yet stepping outside turned my stomach. Even in the daylight, I'd stare at the tree line, half expecting something unnaturally tall and thin to drift between the trunks. It was an exhausting way to live, always looking over my shoulder. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. One evening, I gathered the courage to tell my mom and stepdad some of it. I left out the finer details of gnarly skin and razor-sharp teeth, but I admitted I'd seen a figure in the woods that scared me more than anything else in my life. They exchanged a worried look, but they didn't laugh it off. My mom tried to reassure me that we'd check it out together. My stepdad even offered to walk around with a flashlight once it got dark. The thought of that made my stomach flip, but at least they knew now. I wasn't alone in it anymore. Still, the nights felt haunted. Sometimes just on the edge of hearing, I'd swear I caught my own name, stretched and distorted into something unholy. It never lasted long, and I'd only catch it in that moment between waking and sleep, which left me wondering if it was all in my head. But it never felt imaginary. If anything, it felt like something real messing with me, testing how far it could push before I snapped. Even when the weeks rolled on, and I convinced myself that maybe it was just a terrible misunderstanding, or maybe the figure was gone, I'd sense that charged presence lingering somewhere close. It followed me inside, into my dreams, my everyday routine. The ordinary space I called home had changed forever. I was always waiting for the next sign, a half-glimpsed movement at the window, a bizarre sound scratching at the door, that strange mimic of my mom's voice echoing through the empty yard, and a small part of me feared that each time I sensed it, the encounter would escalate, as if the thing was only growing bolder. That was how life looked from then on. Each day filled with a dread I couldn't fully explain, every night haunted by flickers of a nightmare that might still be out there, lurking just past the place where porch light turns to darkness. The memory of that towering figure shaped my every decision. The future suddenly stretched out in front of me with the ominous promise that I'd never truly leave that moment behind. How could I, when it felt like the encounter had left a mark deep enough to call me back, no matter how hard I tried to run? I've spent most of my life in this town where the population sign reads just over 200, though I'm convinced we might be down to fewer folks some days. You'd think it'd be peaceful, no traffic jams, no neon lights, and nothing but desert and mountains stretching out in all directions. And sure, it has its moments. At sunrise you can feel like you're the only person left on Earth, in a strangely comforting way. But once you realize how alone you truly are, that comfort can twist into something else entirely. My siblings and I kept ourselves entertained by exploring these massive gravel pits on the outskirts of our property. We called it our secret base, though there was nothing secret about it. It was just a big dusty area filled with holes, a few rocks, and a rusted-out sign or two warning people to keep out. Naturally, that made it even more exciting for us. We'd play survival games, pretend we were lost in some epic wilderness. It was the kind of place that felt exhilarating in broad daylight. Yet at the same time, it was always unnervingly quiet back there. One afternoon, all three of us decided to see how far we could go into the pit before freaking ourselves out. We trudged deeper than usual, ignoring the nagging sense that we were treading on ground nobody else bothered with. The silence grew more intense, like the surrounding desert wanted us to know it was paying attention. Then we saw it. A teepee. Someone had taken thick logs, freshly cut, judging by the pale wood, and arranged them into a surprisingly well-built structure. But there are no real trees to speak of in that area, just dusty shrubs and the occasional scrawny bush. The three of us stood there, gaping at this weird teepee that had no business existing out in the gravel pits. For a second, I toyed with the idea of going closer, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I saw that same hesitation in my siblings' eyes. So we backed away, acting tough and casual on the outside, but feeling pretty rattled under the surface. A few days later, curiosity got the better of us, so we returned. We inched around a bend in the pit, and that's when we noticed a dark shape spread out on the ground in front of the teepee's entrance. It turned out to be a crow, or a raven, split straight down the middle. The wings had been stretched out, and there was zero blood anywhere. It was as if someone had dissected the creature in the cleanest, most precise way possible. One of my siblings let out a muffled gasp, and I remember wanting to say something comforting, but my throat refused to cooperate. Without another word, we scurried home, each of us pretending we weren't absolutely disturbed by what we'd seen. We tried to show our mom a little while later, some part of me hoping we'd simply overreacted, but the teepee was gone. Not a single branch remained, as if it had never been there. My mom shot us a skeptical look, which just made it all more unsettling. We were left with the memory of that crow, and the eerie feeling that whoever built the teepee didn't want us bringing any outsiders around. After that, I started noticing oddities wherever I went. A patch of footprints leading nowhere, a hush falling over the yard at twilight, or the way the desert seemed to stare back whenever I glanced at the horizon. I liked to act like it was no big deal, but deep down, part of me dreaded that I'd stumble onto another scene like the one at the gravel pit. And next time, there might not be an exit route so conveniently open. I've always loved the night sky out here. It's colossal and clear, like a dome of scattered diamonds. And if I'm not too distracted by everything that comes with living in the middle of nowhere, I might even find it peaceful. Sometimes, I'd hop into the bed of our pickup, lie back with a jacket tucked under my head, and watch shooting stars streak overhead. The distant mooing of cattle and shouts of farmhands became a nightly soundtrack, until one night, something changed. That evening, the cows started getting rowdy at the usual hour, but over the course of a few minutes, there was a shift in tone. One particular cow began making sounds that were too human. The noise droned on, filling the darkness in a way that felt close, even though the feedlot is a decent stretch away. The cries grew louder, or at least more focused, until they were impossible to block out. My brain kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation, a herd animal, or a weird echo, but my instincts refused to settle down. I abandoned my stargazing and darted into the house, my mind swirling with thoughts I could barely process. Weeks later, I joined my family on our annual summer camping trip up in the mountains. We found an area surrounded by rugged trails and dense woods, a perfect place to turn off the rest of the world. Toad, my loyal dog, came along for the ride. After we'd finished setting up tents and everyone had started gathering brush for a campfire, I decided to scout ahead for bigger logs. Toad trotted at my side, sniffing the ground. I wandered around a bend, and soon I couldn't hear my family's chatter. The noise from our campsite vanished behind me, and that's when a strange tugging sensation drew my attention deeper into the forest. It wasn't a physical force, but it was persuasive, like a whisper in my ear encouraging me to step off the trail. The notion felt ridiculous, yet it was nearly overwhelming. If Toad hadn't pulled back on his leash right then, I might have followed that urge blindly. With one sharp yank, Toad snapped me back to awareness. I spun around and hurried back to my parents and siblings, acting like I'd just been off daydreaming. No way was I about to tell them what nearly happened. The same tension clung to me for the rest of the trip. I tried to sleep in the tent, but each time branches cracked or the wind rustled overhead, my attention shot to Toad. He'd be bristling, ears perked, like he expected something to burst out from behind the nearest tree. Neither of us found much rest that week. Things escalated further one winter night when our husky decided to sprint off into the darkness. It was bitterly cold, and the fog rolled in so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. My mom, my sister and I trudged through drifts, following the husky's tracks and calling his name. Eventually we realized we'd need the truck to keep searching, so I volunteered to head back with Toad while they continued on foot. The walk home felt endless. Clumps of snow muffled my steps, and the swirling mist made me lose track of the road. That's when a voice rose from somewhere in the fields, soft at first, but carrying an odd, droning quality that locked onto my attention. It wasn't English. Didn't sound like Spanish or any language I recognized either. It reminded me of a chant, yet no ceremony or prayer I've ever heard. Normally, anyone out there would need to yell to be heard from such a distance, but this murmur came through crisp and clear. My pulse hammered as I realized it wasn't just noise, it was beckoning. I stood there, Toad at my side, trying to decide what to do. Despite the biting cold, part of me felt compelled to approach, like the sound had a hook in my gut. Toad saved me again, tugging me forward with a determined yank. I stumbled after him, letting him guide me until the dim shape of our house came into view. After I climbed into the truck and locked the doors, I just sat there, staring at the whitened windows, unsure if I was trembling from the chill or something else. Eventually, I remembered Mom and my sister were still out there, so I forced myself to drive in the husky's likely direction. We never did manage to catch him that night. He was back by morning, wagging his tail like he'd just gone on a grand adventure. Meanwhile, I was left wondering who, or what, had been trying to coax me out into the fields. Maybe I was overthinking it, but I couldn't scrub that chanting from my head. It rattled around in my thoughts, especially late at night, when the wind would pick up and the desert seemed to draw a little closer to our doorstep. Now, whenever I stare out the windows at night, I take note of whether the usual farm sounds are present. Because the moment that quiet sets in, heavy and complete, I know something might be watching, waiting for a chance to make itself known again. And the worst part is, I'm almost certain it won't stop. Toad seems convinced of that too, and that's enough for me to keep every door locked and every light on when the sun goes down. I went to sleep way later than I'd planned, close to midnight, and all I wanted was a few hours of decent rest. The place I call home isn't what you'd call welcoming after dark. It's perched on a rugged incline, surrounded by these looming trees that block out most light once the sun goes down. Usually I find it peaceful, but that night something felt off. Around 3 in the morning my eyes flew open. At first I couldn't pin down what had jolted me awake. No loud crash, no rattling window, just this sense that I wasn't alone. My throat felt dry, so I slipped out of bed, trying not to make a sound. The hallway was almost pitch black except for a thin shaft of moonlight slicing across the floor. I could have sworn the whole house was holding secrets I didn't want to uncover. By the time I made it to the kitchen, my nerves were jangling. The faucet squeaked, and the water I gulped down tasted stale, like it had been sitting in the pipes too long. Normally, I'd check my phone or listen to some late-night show to calm down, but something told me to stay quiet and keep my senses sharp. When I got back to my room, I eased myself onto the edge of the bed and happened to glance out the window. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, but the moon was bright enough to show the outlines of branches stretching at my level, like a haunted walkway suspended in mid-air. At first, the trees looked empty, just swaying leaves and twisting shapes. But there was a darker form out there that I couldn't explain. It was perched on a thick branch, kind of hunched, yet still taking up a lot of space. That shape was wrong, too tall, too angular, and definitely watching me. I caught a faint glimmer of red where its eyes should have been, a color that didn't belong in that landscape of silvery moonlight. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Animal, human, something else entirely. It had this lanky outline, like its limbs stretched out more than they should, and it didn't look the least bit uncomfortable balancing in those branches. I swallowed the lump in my throat and leaned in, trying to convince myself this was just my imagination. But there was no trick of the light here. It was real enough to tighten every muscle in my body. And it was studying me, as though it was used to being the one hidden in the dark, rarely caught off guard. After an agonizing stretch of time that might have only been 10 or 15 seconds, the figure shifted, cocking its head in a way that screamed curiosity, or worse, recognition. I thought about reaching for my phone, calling someone, anyone. But I couldn't bring myself to move. A sick kind of fascination rooted me to the spot. Just as I started to regain some composure, the creature vanished from the branch with a sudden fluid motion. I leapt off the bed and rushed to the window, half expecting to see it sprawled out below. Instead, I glimpsed it weaving through the undergrowth at an unbelievable speed. The brush shook like something massive was forcing a path downhill, heading deeper into the forest shadows. Even after it disappeared, I stayed frozen at the window, mentally replaying what I'd seen. I couldn't have made it up. It was too vivid, too unsettling. The rest of the night was just me sitting there, lights on, barely blinking. I knew sleep wasn't happening. My mind wouldn't stop racing through 1,000 questions. Was it coming back? Had it been lurking there before? Would it have just watched me if I hadn't noticed it first? When a faint hint of dawn finally crept over the treetops, I still felt pinned in place by that silent encounter. That moonlit glimpse of something beyond normal logic stuck with me. And the most unnerving part, it seemed to know I was there the whole time, as if this was its territory, and I'd stumbled into something I wasn't meant to see. I barely slept a wink after what happened, so I was awake before dawn even had a chance to stretch across the sky. The minute the sunlight finally crept in, I forced myself to peel away from the window. My eyes felt gritty, my head hurt, and my nerves were completely shot. But I needed some kind of proof that last night wasn't a hallucination. When I first looked out at the trees bathed in morning light, it almost felt like the forest itself was mocking me, flaunting its newfound serenity. Gone were the eerie moonlit shadows and that terrifying silhouette. Now, everything looked ordinary, like any other stretch of woods on a clear day. But I knew better than to let daylight fool me. After gulping down a cup of coffee, I decided to walk around the perimeter of my property. Honestly, I could have used some extra caffeine, or maybe something stronger, but I had to do this while my courage was still high. The sun was surprisingly bright, making me squint as I stepped outside. It's like the world was saying, "See, nothing to be scared of." I wasn't buying it. My boots crunched over patchy grass as I made my way toward the tree line, scanning every inch of the ground. Part of me felt ridiculous, like I was on a scavenger hunt for footprints or claw marks. But I needed to see something that would confirm what I'd witnessed. I kept noticing snapped twigs, flattened areas in the brush, and places where the pine needles seemed disturbed. Could have been deer, could have been anything really. Yet each irregularity made my stomach clench, conjuring images of last night's creature trampling its way through. When I finally got back inside, I realized my hands were shaking. Not from the chill in the air, but from the memory of those glowing red eyes. I grabbed the nearest notebook and scrawled down every detail. How tall it seemed, that hunched posture, the incredible speed at which it bolted into the undergrowth. My writing was uneven, and ink bled in places where I pressed the pen too hard. Reliving the memory turned my nerves raw all over again. I spent the next hour or two crouched in front of my laptop, diving deep into the darkest corners of cryptid forums. I read about everything from Wendigos to skinwalkers to unclassified forest folk. None of these descriptions matched exactly what I'd seen, though. I clicked through post after post, scanning for any mention of elongated limbs and glowing eyes perched at tree level. My head started spinning with folklore I'd never heard of, each more bizarre than the last. There was so much nonsense out there, but also just enough plausible detail to keep my paranoia on a steady burn. By early afternoon I was so anxious that every small noise made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator was suddenly too loud, the tick of the clock too sharp. I'd whip my head toward the window at the slightest hint of motion, half convinced I'd see that tall shape lurking in the high branches. But nothing was there. Just swaying leaves and sunlight dancing through the gaps. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to let my guard down. The worst part was this persistent thought worming its way through my brain. Did that thing really see me, or was I intruding on its domain? The question nagged at me so much that by late afternoon, I caught myself pacing the living room, trying to distract myself with half-hearted chores. No luck. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes staring back. Before I knew it, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Night fell quickly in these woods, and as the daylight drained, my sense of safety went with it. The house felt less like home, and more like a flimsy shelter against something that should never have been this close in the first place. I left every light on, even the porch light, just to keep the darkness at bay. But 100 bright bulbs wouldn't have driven away that uneasy feeling. The house started groaning and creaking as it usually does at night, but now each little sound threatened to send my heart galloping. I settled in by the window with a flashlight in hand, watching the branches turn into spindly silhouettes under the moonlight. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, yet I didn't dare look away for more than a few seconds. Part of me wanted to spot it again, just to be absolutely sure I wasn't losing my mind. Another part of me dreaded the idea it might already be watching, hidden in the leaves, waiting for the right moment to show itself. The possibility of a repeat encounter had me on edge, and I knew a second sighting would confirm that last night was no weird fluke. The clock edged closer to midnight, and still no sign of anything. But the tension in my chest never let up. Deep down, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of an even darker secret, one that might be lurking just beyond my vision. By the time the chapter of night ended, I was left with one unshakable truth. I wasn't alone here. This place, the one I'd called home for so long, no longer felt like it belonged entirely to me. Something else was out there, and it seemed more aware of me than I ever wanted it to be. I woke up last night gasping for air, the echoes of screeching sounds bouncing around in my head. It took a moment to remember where I was, curled up in my own bed, blankets twisted around me. My thoughts turned immediately to my old ferret, the one that died just a few weeks ago. My mind keeps circling back to how enormous it got toward the end, like a small cat, maybe even bigger, and the way it almost sang this low, croaking melody instead of squeaking. In the final days of its life, it acted like it knew something the rest of us didn't. Sometimes I'd find it standing on its hind legs for so long, it felt like we were locked in a staring contest. Its gaze was eerily calm, locked onto me in a way no pet should ever look at anyone. My mom tried to get me to examine the body once it passed, but I shrugged her off. I thought she was just being odd about the whole situation. Turns out maybe she had a reason. Not long after the ferret died, I decided to clear my head by going for a walk with a friend. We joked around, teased each other, just messing around as usual. We both needed a laugh after the weirdness of the past few weeks. Then I noticed a deer lurking a few yards ahead, still as a statue, almost as though it had been planted there. Normally a deer would bolt the moment it spotted us, but this one just stared. My friend, being braver than me, tried calling it closer with little clicks and snaps of his fingers. Strangely enough, the deer obeyed, like it recognized us somehow. We took a goofy selfie, with the deer right behind our shoulders. It looked at the camera. No, it looked through the camera, like it saw something inside the lens. We shrugged it off at first, marveling at how tame it acted, but neither of us could erase the sense that something was off. We even talked about it later, how its eyes felt more intense than a regular animal's, but we let the conversation drift away. Then maybe 15 minutes after we parted ways with that deer, we spotted it again in the distance, only this time it was upright on its hind legs, bobbing along in a stiff, lopsided gallop. We burst out laughing, part shock, part disbelief, because nobody would take us seriously if we tried to explain a deer prancing around like some awkward two-legged circus act. But that sight stuck with me. It shouldn't have happened. It made me think about how my ferret used to stand, arms dangling by its sides like it was trying to mimic a person. The coincidence was too strange. Still, I filed it away under too weird for words, and tried to move on. Later that evening, though, I couldn't stop replaying the image of that deer in my head. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw it lurching on two legs. All at once, I was back in my room, thinking about the ferret, recalling the day it just expired without warning. And then came that screeching again, a memory or something else, I'm not sure. It rattled me so hard I swore my vision blurred. For a split second, I even thought I heard claws scratching against the floor. But when I glanced around, nothing was there. Now I'm lying here again. unable to get comfortable. I keep feeling like I'm being observed, even in the dark. It's not exactly fear, more like a crawling tension at the base of my neck, telling me that maybe the deer and my pet shared a connection. Part of me wants to go check on my mom, ask her what she really saw when she tried to show me the ferret's body. The rest of me is too on edge to move. I promised myself that tomorrow I'd try to be logical, maybe do a bit of research on local wildlife or bizarre animal behavior. But as tonight drags on, I can't help suspecting that nothing about this is going to be explained by a few Google searches. Something's unfolding, and I'm not sure if it started with my ferret's last breath, or if that was just my first glimpse of something far darker. Whatever the truth is, I'm starting to think it's coming for me, step by step, sighting by sighting, scratch by scratch. I needed to get away. At least that's what I told myself when I pulled up to the hotel. The place was as unremarkable as you'd expect. A gray building perched off the main road, with a big neon sign announcing it had a pub inside. It looked normal enough from the outside. Turns out, appearances can be deceiving. Everything felt more tense than it should. As I hauled my bag toward the reception desk, I noticed the hallway wasn't fully enclosed. One side opened straight to the outdoors, letting in a damp chill. A few stray cats were slinking around the corners, hissing at each other. I remember thinking the architecture was weird. Why have a hallway leading to the guest rooms be so exposed? Still, I checked in, thinking I'd use the hotel's pub to drown out the freakish memories of that deer from before, and the ferret that kicked off my nightmares. I dropped my things in the room, freshened up, and headed down to the pub, wanting nothing more than a few hours of distraction. That night, the pub was lively enough. A small stage set up for amateur performers. A handful of tired travelers milling around the bar, half watching the guy on stage sing some off-key song. I sat by myself, ordered a drink. For a while I let the hum of conversation and clinking glasses lull me into forgetting how messed up my life had been feeling. Almost managed to convince myself I dreamt up that deer on two legs. But when the pub finally closed and I stumbled out into that open-air hallway, I realized normalcy was short-lived. I heard this slow shuffling noise around the bend, like someone dragging a heavy object. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking a bit. Normally I wouldn't pry, but an uncomfortable feeling told me to check. I edged forward and spotted a woman, maybe in her 50s, overweight and breathing raggedly. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, and her eyes darted in every direction, as if she expected something to jump out at her. "Ma'am, are you—" I started to ask, but she cut me off with a weird, slurring speech about needing a waiter. It was such a random thing to say in an empty hallway that I paused. I thought maybe she was having a medical emergency, so I took a cautious step closer. And then she turned her head, a full 180-degree turn. There was a wet snap, like the sound of a large branch splintering in a storm. In that moment, all reason dissolved into raw panic. Her face twisted backward while the rest of her body stayed facing me, the wide-eyed expression she wore. I can still see it in my mind. Her lips were parted, making a faint rasp. She let out this quiet moan and then started moving. Not walking exactly. Her feet dragged along the floor, leaving scuff marks. It reminded me of someone being yanked by the ankles, only there was no one there. I flattened myself against the wall, trying not to breathe. The lights overhead flickered, each burst of brightness giving me a new glimpse of her contorted form. She kept gliding forward, if that's even the right word, disappearing around the corner. Part of me wanted to follow, ask if she needed help or if she was even human at all. Instead, I stayed put, pressing my entire body so tightly against the wall that I might as well have melted into it. After a few agonizing minutes of holding my breath, or barely breathing, I realized the woman was gone. That's when I forced myself to sprint back to my room. I could hear my shoes slapping against the linoleum floor, a frantic echo. Once I was inside, I flipped the deadbolt, locked the chain, even wedged a chair under the knob, like in a bad horror movie, only it felt way too real. I collapsed onto the bed, heart hammering. 1,000 explanations ran through my mind. She was sick, maybe hallucinating. But that doesn't explain how her head spun all the way around, or how she glided, leaving those trails on the floor. Sleep was useless. I might have dozed off once or twice, but each time, I was startled awake by low feral moans outside my door. They sounded less human, and more like some large animal in distress. The scratch, scratch, scratch that followed felt deliberate, as though something wanted to claw straight through the wood. I just sat on the mattress, back against the headboard, staring at the door. I didn't even trust myself to turn on the light. Eventually the scraping faded, replaced by an eerie quiet that was worse because I didn't know if it was really gone or just waiting. I checked my phone, saw it was well past midnight. That's when the thought hit me. Maybe all these things, the giant ferret, the deer on 2 legs, now this twisted neck woman, are pieces of some unholy puzzle, and I might be caught right at the center of it. By the time morning light seeped under the curtains, I felt like I'd aged a decade. My body ached from tension. My head pounded with unanswered questions. One realization loomed above all else. I couldn't handle another night like this. Whatever plagued me, and maybe others too, wasn't just going to disappear on its own. As insane as it sounded, I knew I had to be the one to track it down, confront it, stop it, whatever it might take. I remember muttering to myself, setting a date. July 23rd. Somehow, that seemed like a day far enough away for me to prepare, but soon enough that I wouldn't lose my nerve. I had no idea if I'd be facing one creature or many, but I knew I had to try. The open-air hallway outside felt weighed down by something. Even in broad daylight, it looked darker than the rest of the property, like a perpetual twilight had settled in. Shoving my things into my bag, I took a last glance down that corridor. A breeze drifted through, carrying a hint of decay, like a faint, rotting smell that made my skin crawl. I'm still not sure if I imagined it, or if it was real. Either way, I hustled out of there, determined to gear up for whatever comes next. Because I've learned the worst part of this entire ordeal isn't the terror, it's the not knowing when it'll strike again. And I've had my fill of that. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope tonight's stories kept you company in the dark. Sleep well, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe. Good night, and see you in the next one.